Hi, and welcome everyone to the podcast of the Hodges Foundation for Philosophical Orientation. My name is Reinhard Mueller. I'm the executive director of the foundation, and I'm very excited that I have today with me James Sirigotis, who is our current fellow, who's the second fellow actually in our fellowship program. And in this program, we support fellows who work with the philosophy of orientation, who apply it, who further develop it ideally. And that's what James is doing in his dissertation, and I'm happy to talk to him about and get to know him some more today. So, hi James, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Reinhardt. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, it's good to see you. It seems like you're kind of in the final stages of your dissertation. Is that true, or?
Yeah, that's true. Final stages, I think, can get a little murky sometimes, but yeah, I'm kind of finishing up writing, and I'll be working on job documents over the summer and applying to jobs in the coming year.
Nice. Yeah, it's a hard time, especially at the end of the PhD program. And I guess today, I think what would be interesting to get to know a little bit about you, kind of where you're from, what brought you to work on this dissertation topic, and kind of get to know you a bit more. And so your dissertation is entitled Resilient Optionality: Infrastructures of Water, Feeling, and Finance. So that's interesting title. So we'll get there in a little bit. So maybe before we go there, kind of where are you from, and like what led you to the path of maybe academia or this topic? So just maybe a little bit of background.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm from New Jersey. I was born and raised in Bridgewater, New Jersey. I was, and like unconventionally, I was homeschooled for all the way up until 8th grade, which I think played a pretty. I think being homeschooled kind of fostered a kind of curiosity, and my mom was pretty like uh, open and flexible with our routines and schedules and stuff. I was a pretty hyperactive kid, and so yeah, having that kind of really nice, supportive home environment to both like learn and explore. I think kind of cultivated a deeper sense of curiosity that I think is still very much with me today.
Did you also have teachers actually, or was it just your parents teaching you?
It was just my mom, actually. Yeah, I have two
Wow,
sisters. Yeah, an older and a younger sister. My mom taught all of us
interesting.
up through middle school.
Well, what is the professional background of your mom?
Shoot, well, she was an accountant. Actually, that's her
Oh,
professional background.
interesting.
But she was like a music major before she went into accounting, and she was like the choir director at our church for like 13 years and stuff. So she kind of wore a lot of hats. Very like dynamic woman for sure. So yeah, so she just kind of took it on herself to teach us. So she would like order textbooks, from online and kind of teach all three of us in 3 different grades at the same time. So that's why it was kind of had to be flexible and a little fluid. But I'm really grateful for it. I thought it was a really lovely opportunity as someone who probably wouldn't have done so great being forced to like sit in a chair for like long periods of time at that age. So and then the more kind of intermitting period was like my dad was a financial advisor. So I kind of anticipated going into that field for most of my like high school years and stuff. And then I went to college and started as a business major, but there I also took some really interesting sociology classes and a couple of philosophy classes, and those like really piqued my interest. And so I changed my major. I transferred schools, went back to New Jersey, and yeah, just really kind of like fell in love with sociology. I feel like one of the things that sociology really brought me was out of a kind of bubble I feel like I had lived in for most of my life. I grew up in like middle class suburban New Jersey, and then went to a private like a Catholic high school, and then started at a private college. And sociology really kind of opened my mind and my eyes to a lot of other things that were going on in the world that I just had no clue of really. And so that was very like exciting, like invigorating of an experience. And I also had a lot of good experiences with professors, where I had professors who were really passionate about what they did, that kind of held out this idea for me. Oh, well, maybe I could do that too. So that's kind of like how I ended up going to grad school. one of my main interests in going to grad school, like the kind of project that I applied with, was around the question of political action or inaction. So basically the question of like, why do people participate or not participate in politics? And that research or question grew out of some research I had done in coastal New Jersey with basically environmental justice issues. There are areas that have like really bad legacies of environmental injustice, but there are also like newer, wealthier developments happening nearby. And I was really curious about like how people kind of like navigate those realities and how they, what kinds of everyday experiences lead them to or away from political activity. Then when I came to grad school, it changed a little bit.
Were you in business school already, or was that in undergrad?
It was in undergrad.
Okay.
Yeah, I was on track actually to enter the business school at Southern Methodist University, which is where I started my undergrad. But then decided to switch to sociology. So I never actually, I took like the earlier like econ, micro and macro econ, accounting, some statistics classes and stuff kind of on my way to business school. But in the process, I just had a little bit of a change of heart.
Interesting. What did you ever think that you missed out on options in business school?
To be honest, I haven't really thought about that. So, I mean, no, to be honest, I never really considered that so much until more recently, whereas like the later stages of grad school can be pretty financially tough. And so sometimes these days I do think about what it would have been like if I had like a little bit more resources. But for the most part, I was like very confident in my decision. I think like growing up in the world I did, like with my dad doing what he did and the other people I went to school with and stuff, I had like I felt like I had a pretty good sense of what that life or future would have held for me. And I was happy to be making a different choice and pursuing this different route.
Yeah, so
in some ways, actually, in some ways, I feel like the route I chose has provided me with more options in the sense that it's given me a much wider breadth of people and places and situations to learn about and learn from and encounter and stuff. So,
that's so in the end, it was, I guess, passion and interest, right, which led your also kind of values in a sense that kind of the business values were something that wasn't interesting to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that. I was pretty, when I was younger, as I said, I kind of lived in a little bit of a bubble. I don't think I was particularly aware of a lot of the social problems that exist. And as I learned more about them, I just felt like I would be more fulfilled working on social problems as opposed to, more, maybe a little more narrow focus on things like profit or wages, or even, of course, not to say that all like private jobs or all finance is just about maximizing like returns. But that's always kind of part of it. And I didn't really want to be, I didn't want that to be determining a lot of my like decisions and actions. So academia is really appealing, right? Because you have this thing called academic freedom, where like whatever it is that you find interesting, you have the freedom to go and learn about it and engage in it. And as long as you can, there's the publish or perish thing, but as long as you can actually write things and get them out there, then you really do have that liberty to choose how you spend your time, who you're spending it with, and what you're thinking about.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it, actually. I like that. Yeah. So wait, so where were you? So you went to grad school. Where was that again?
Yeah, so I went to grad school in Santa Cruz, at UC Santa Cruz. And yeah, when I was there, I started thinking about this question of political inaction. And as I thought about it more, and this has to do with partially with like one of my advisors, Deborah Gould, helped me kind of come to this realization or this turn. But I became more interested in, and it's probably like just a bigger scale of the same question, but what people conceive or imagine as politically possible or impossible. so that if people don't feel or sense that political change is really possible, then of course they wouldn't be particularly motivated to participate in political action and so on. And so that's kind of a big motivator for behind my work today, is like, how do we understand what we might call like a political horizon, and what kinds of experiences, our institutional arrangements, our historical processes, either kind of like expand or kind of curtail that sense of possibility.
That's interesting. That is something where, so it's the political horizon can be larger or smaller, and so is there some factors or influences, or what is the strongest influence? Is there something that you found out that has the biggest impact on one's political horizon? I mean, I'm assuming there's something like media, education, money, or is there anything that you found surprising?
Well, I think for a long time, there's been a kind of a sense on the left and the right. So, for example, there's this famous quote by Margaret Thatcher, that the Tina quote, that there is no alternative to capitalism, or Francis Fukuyama's point about the end of history, right? So, and then there are also people on the left, people like Frederick Jameson, who is famously known as saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than like the end of capitalism, right? So I think there's just a broad sense that we have kind of hit some kind of wall historically in terms of like how we organize our society, and that we've kind of reached an apogee of some sorts, or and I think for a lot of people who see the ongoing injustices and inequalities and problems of our contemporary society, they're a little more reluctant to just accept that as the truth. And so I think that has a part to play in it, right? Like how much you kind of, as a subject, how much you are willing to accept things as they are and say, okay, this is what we've got. Or like how eager are you or interested in are you into imagining how things could be different, and then thinking about how can we make that happen in a meaningful way.
Because I'm thinking about, so I'm from East Germany, right? Born before the wall fell,
Right.
and just growing up there. I mean, it was after the reunification, but still, it seemed that there are options, right? That kind of an alternative political system is an option, because it was, right, and so there's also, and it was. I mean, Hitler Germany wasn't that long ago, right? So there was another alternative. And so
Sure.
there's this memory, right? And so I'm wondering if that also has to do with it, especially in the US, because the political system hasn't not fundamentally changed in many decades, right? And so I wonder if and overall, I mean, people, there's a perception of that it's a good system. People like it. It's successful. It's working, right? And so I wonder if that kind of narrows also one's options of thinking in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think definitely. I mean, I agree. I think some people might feel like it's working better than others, right? And then that might influence how willing or interested they are in imagining alternatives.
Right. So let's talk about your dissertation. The topic is once again, so it's resilient optionality, infrastructures of water, feeling, and finance. And so the connection is interesting, of infrastructures of water, feeling, and finance. So that is something I'm wondering about. But maybe we start in the beginning. This topic of resilient optionality, how did you discover it? Let's say, is there something like an intuition? Often, I think with dissertation topics or big research projects, there's something. At least for me, it's often you have this intuition, and then you kind of follow it, and then you have a topic, right? And so.
Right.
Is there something, was there a point when you were like, oh, this is my topic, I'm gonna work on this?
Yeah. So it's kind of it's, I feel like maybe with a lot of dissertation topics, but it's a little bit of like a roundabout way that I got there. But let's see. So really interested, coming from the kind of environmental justice and like social movement space, and then getting more interested in questions of political economy. I was studying a lot of the kind of, there's a literature called The Production of Nature, which is like looking at a lot about how our political and economic system plays a really central role in shaping the landscape, and therefore kind of like producing the natures that we see. And then there's like a newer kind of literature around like new materialisms, a little more philosophical literature that kind of talks about the productive, vital, complex qualities of the natural world. And so I was working with these two sets of literatures, thinking about the relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world. And one of the things, and then in my continued interest in political economy, I started taking classes on finance in particular. So as I mentioned, my dad was in finance, so I had kind of always like an early interest in it. We also happen to live in what many people call like the most financialized mode or form of capitalism that's existed. Modern finance is more technically sophisticated, has wider global reach and all that stuff. And so in my learning and studies about finance, and particularly these like newer parts of finance, like derivatives and options derivatives in particular, I started to recognize all of these kind of affinities between the kinds of ideas that exist in the new materialism literature, basically kinds of ideas around epistemology and ontology, that we live in a complex world with feedback loops, nonlinearity, all that stuff, and an epistemology of like a kind of limits to knowledge epistemology, right? That the future is fundamentally unknowable, complex systems are even more unknowable and hard to predict, and so on. And so as I was reading this and this kind of political, kind of philosophical literature about the relationship between humans and the rest of nature, I was encountering those same exact themes in my finance classes, around what an options derivative is and why it was created. It was created because the world was complex and it was filled with all these positive feedback loops and non-equilibrium things, which of course is very counter to conventional neoclassical economics, right? And that there is like a fundamental non-knowledge of the future. And so options are basically like financial products designed to deal with this reality, with this complex reality that you cannot predict. And so that's part of how I started to see. And then of course, like in the new materialism literature, I also study like urban development and infrastructure and so on. And so once you take kind of these more complex notions of ecology or nature and so on, and kind of bring them into a kind of urban development or infrastructure type realm, you get a lot of, I kept bumping into this idea of resilience. It was like everywhere. And so one of the things that I found was a paper by Crawford Halling from 1973. It was kind of like the initial paper that brought kind of complex systems theory to ecology and resource management. And in that paper, which is basically the first big paper on ecological resilience, the last paragraph is his kind of advice for practitioners. And his first piece of advice for practitioners is to design systems that keep options open. And this just like resonated so powerfully with options derivatives, which that's exactly what they functionally like do, is keep those options open for periods of time. So with that kind of experience going on in my time in grad school, of kind of these two different things bumping into each other and feeling all of these affinities, I also just noticed in my kind of review of the fields that a lot of people had done histories of finance, and the kind of like technical and social histories of finance, and other people had done histories of the kind of production of nature type analysis. But there weren't that many people who looked at the intersection of the two. and how our conception of nature and the way that it was being produced by our social systems was informed by the financial developments in histories that were going on, and how the financial developments in histories were informed by the environmental conditions as well, not just social and historical conditions. And so that's part of what my project tries to do, is give like full weight to both the kind of social historical dimension, but also the kind of like natural and ecological dimension, and kind of trace the kind of intersecting or overlapping of these two kind of orientation worlds, we might say, of finance and ecology.
So you kind of explained your title already in a sense, right? When you say there's so resilient optionality, infrastructures of water, feeling, and finance. So it's basically infrastructures of water is the ecological aspect, the way of how we orient ourselves to nature, and then finance, and in between feeling of how we feel about it. Is that it? Or
yeah, kind of. So that title is actually a play off of Raymond Williams' concept of the structure of feeling. So Raymond Williams was a great like literary critic, and he has this great concept called structure of feeling, which is basically a kind of emergent style or way of feeling that exists within a particular historical moment, right? And they kind of might be tied to generations, or to different, might be ushered in by different large historical events. In more colloquial terms, it might be just understood as like a public mood or a public sentiment. And so because his concept is really about this kind of like underlying affective atmosphere, or to something like that, through which people's subjectivity and actions and institutions emerge, I was kind of playing with it and said, oh, maybe it's actually more of an infrastructure of feeling as opposed to a structure of feeling, because it is that kind of underground kind of doesn't get that much explicit attention, but it's really central to how everything works, right? And then I wanted to tie that up with, of course, the most obvious, like physical infrastructure of large-scale water projects in California, and then, of course, the new, like an options contract, or the options market, we might say, is a new financial infrastructure that has allowed all kinds of things to happen that were not possible previously.
so resilient optionality. So both terms, they ring a bell. Putting them together, I guess, is there something like a central thesis or like a claim in your dissertation? I don't know. Can you summarize it in a way, or?
Yeah, I mean, I've like a kind of a historical argument that I'm making throughout my thesis, which I'm happy to just tell you about. But just in terms of like that kind of formulation of resilient optionality is, as I was saying, like the first advice to practitioners for how to create a resilient system is to keep options open, from Holland, right, in the original paper. And so one of like my intention between putting the two together is really to emphasize, in fact, that optionality, or having options, is kind of a constitutive dimension of resilience. That's how one might like operationally achieve resilience, is by having a set of options, so that when an unexpected event or shock or stressor might occur, you have kind of an option, or route kind of like around or over that challenge or that hurdle. And so by putting them together, I was just trying to, one, emphasize that resilience is kind of constituted by options, and then two, to also kind of point out that in finance and other places, of course, options do not last forever. And so having options that are themselves resilient and can persist amidst uncertainties and so on, makes them even more valuable and leads to even greater resilience. So they kind of feed back and forth into each other.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm wondering if, because there's so many questions right now. So either I'm wondering how you're using the philosophy of orientation. I don't know if you want to talk about this here, or if you can show with an example what that means, resilient optionality, or if we talk about history right away. So I don't know what path you want to take.
I'll try to let's try to do the first two, and then we can get to history. Maybe. Okay. So when I lived in Santa Cruz, there was like an intense wildfire, and people had to evacuate. And so there was like, to use a concept from philosophy of orientation, there was like time pressure, right? The fire was coming, people had to move, you have to move now, you have to make a decision. And when you make the decision or you make a choice, right, what are you choosing from? You're choosing from the options that are available to you. And so certain options might provide like more leeway or provide a foothold that helps you like navigate the fire. So we could think about like maybe 3 different groups of people who lived in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the 3 different kind of options that were available. So one option, probably the most straightforward and obvious one today would be to have insurance on your home so that when the fire came, you maybe got a check from the insurance company to go stay in a hotel in downtown, right? So you were kind of paying this premium for this insurance policy. And then when the unexpected event happens, it provides you with an option, a way out. And okay, so that's one kind. So we could think about that as a kind of like market form of option. I go out onto the market and I buy an insurance contract, right? And I pay for it with money, and it comes back to me as an individual who paid for it. Some people who didn't have maybe home insurance would go, the FEMA came and set up a camp in Santa Cruz, downtown Santa Cruz, to help people who were evacuated. So that's kind of another option, right? And that option was kind of provided by the state. It gives them, again, an out, somewhere to go, to get food, water, whatever they might need. And that is, what I would call like a public option, right? Like through the state, a state option. And so it's not as individualized. It doesn't necessarily require the same type of individualized payments, right? It's kind of funded by the tax base more broadly. So it's more public social form of optionality. And then there was another option emerged in the case of the wildfire in Santa Cruz, which Santa Cruz has like a really vibrant local community with like a lot of really engaged community groups. And a lot of them participate in various forms of like mutual aid. And so I remember driving through town like during the fires and seeing all of these people like set up with like big vans or cars like along the side of the road, and they had food, cooked meals, like groceries to take home, clothes. Some of them were offering to have people stay in their homes and so on, who had to be evacuated and so on. So that is like another type of option, right? What I like might call a solidarity option or a mutual aid kind of option that doesn't actually require financial exchanges, any kind of like monetary exchange, and is again more collective, not public in the sense of a formal state, but collective and open to whoever might need it in a way. And so these are like 3 different options that were available to people who got evacuated in this moment of crisis. And all 3 of these options provided a form of resilience and security to the people who needed it in that moment. And so, yeah, we can think about like the philosophy of orientation in terms of like what kind of leeway, for example, that those different options provided, right? Some of them might have provided more leeway than others. Perhaps the FEMA camp wasn't as well resourced as the insurance contract payment was, or perhaps like the community group would have offered like a broader range of resources and might have offered things that you couldn't have gotten with the insurance contract, like making new friends or something like this. But yeah, that's like one example. I'm happy to talk about others. Or
yeah, having multiple options that's always good, or no? That kind of wasn't it always good to have a lot of options, like for anybody? Kind of, isn't it always good to have more? And so even for, I guess I'm wondering more, I guess, philosophically or in evolutionary history, so that humans had more abilities to choose between options, and that gave them an evolutionary advantage. I don't know if we can think of it in those terms, right? And so there's something that where where there's almost, in a sense, an evolutionary history of the more options you have, the better it is for your survival even.
That's definitely the way that, for example, it's understood in finance, and even probably how it's like understood, although in less explicit terms, in like kind of resilience discourse. But I think there are a couple of things that we maybe are a little less intuitive that come up when you have a lot of options. So the first thing I would say is that there's a difference between good and bad options. So some options are just better than others. And so having more really bad options might not be better than having less good ones. For example, one thing that really influences that is like, how long is the option going to last? Right. So if you have an option for a very short period of time that's going to rush you, put a lot of time pressure on you to like make this decision right now, then it doesn't really give you much time to, for example, collect additional information or see how things are playing out to then make a more informed choice later. Right. Some options are just like a lot more expensive than others. And that might make them, it might not be a good bang for your buck, so to speak. Some of them are more rigid. Some options, in a way, are kind of like self-fulfilling. If you think about options and through the kind of lens of the kind of preemptive action of logic, oftentimes when you kind of take steps to, in case something happens, those steps might actually facilitate that thing happening in itself, right? So, and this happens within the options markets, which we've talked about a little bit in the past, about how certain kinds of options activity can affect the kind of underlying asset that they're supposed to be derived from. So bad options might also appear as simple trade-offs, where alternatives appear like mutually exclusive. And yeah, they oftentimes, like, you can have an option, but you have to sacrifice something in the process, right, with that trade-off. So there are other options that don't require a sacrifice and aren't mutually exclusive and stuff. So that's like those are a couple ideas about what makes a good or a bad option. And then the other thing I just wanted to point out about the idea of having more options, more equals better, is something that some people have talked about as the optionality trap. Or other people, a famous psychologist, I think his name is Schwartz, talked about the paradox of choice. And so if you have so many options to choose from, especially if none of them are that great, or if none of them are that bad, then you can be in a situation where you're constantly deferring the decision about which option you're choosing, and never end up deciding, right? And that could lead to a type of paralysis or intense kind of like fear of missing out, or failure to make any kinds of commitments or really like progress forward in any way, because you're constantly holding out for the next best thing, which is always around the corner, right? So
yeah, no, that's a good point. I was actually just going to bring that up, right? Where it seems that we, especially today, the world is full of options. I mean, through the internet, right? You can, through a smartphone, you can do everything in every moment, right? You can book a flight anywhere, you can buy anything, and you can take a class or whatever you want to do, right? And so all the options are kind of almost always available. I mean, of course, it still takes time to get somewhere, and there's still places, and you can't hang out with everybody, but there's a simultaneity of so many options as never before, probably.
definitely,
right? And so
yeah,
that's something where it seems that this can also be overwhelming, right? And so, I mean, especially people, people who have a lot of options. I mean, there's examples of very rich people who had too many options and too many things that they could do, that it collapsed, or they were paralyzed, or they got depressed, and so on, right? And so there's also the overwhelming aspect of options, right?
absolutely.
And it seems it's especially, maybe that is what younger generations grow up with today, though, right? Everything is always available in a sense.
Yeah, except for the things that aren't, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting, which is
Yeah.
like part of my interest in the topic of what's possible and impossible, right? So we might think So yes, in terms of like, for example, goods to buy or color shirts to wear or restaurants to eat at, right?
Mhm.
There is a tremendous profusion of options that are only continuing to multiply. If you think about dating apps,
Mhm.
the kind of swiping thing, right? There's a lot of options there. So yeah, we're kind of, when you go to buy a plane ticket, right? There's like 17 different possible upgrade options that you can have. Or when you go to get a retirement account, there's like 40 different types of retirement account options that you can choose from, right? So I think part of the thing that's interesting to think about with that is like, there might be a lot of options within a relatively homogeneous field, right? So there's like a million different commodities, right? But what about things that are not commodities, right? There's not so many of those, in fact, right? There's not so many options. Or for work, right? There's not that many options that are, maybe not exploitative, or certain people have access to more kind of work options that are more or less exploitative, and so on. So I think, yes, we're hit with a profusion of options, definitely, and sometimes that might even prevent us from seeing um, some other options that don't appear or feel like they're on the table, but might be, in fact.
I feel there's always some people have a good sense for what the right option is, and other people don't, right? And so there's, or often, I mean, many times it has to do with experience, or with like a skill, a professional skill, for example. I mean, if you think about like a soccer game or any sport, right? There's all the options on the moment, but the really good player knows exactly the best option, right? And so,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about. I guess
Yeah.
choosing the right option as a skill is, I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I've thought about like optionality as an orientation skill.
Right.
That's like a very, so one of the ways that I sometimes talk about optionality is a strategic orientation to the future once um, the expansion of possibilities becomes conscious, right? So once we realize how uncertain and how open the future is to various possibilities, right? Then optionality becomes a very kind of strategic way of trying to imagine what different possibilities could be realized, and weighing them, trying to value which ones would be best, and then trying to make that one happen, or pursue that one, or set yourself up down that route. And so in that way, this kind of strategic dimension of optionality as an orientation skill, sure, is definitely on display in sporting events. It's on display in cocktail hours or networking events. It's on display, um, with military strategy, of course, or even innovation strategy or investment strategy. Someone who talks about optionality a lot, actually, is the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell. I was watching his press conference yesterday, and he didn't use the word optionality, although he has in the past. He used it actually 1 year prior. So in his June 22 press conference, he justified the rapid rate increases um, as giving the Fed more optionality in the future. So once we get those rates to what is like a normal rate, then we'll have more optionality to decide, like, if we want to go up or down or what have you, right? And 1 year later, yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, I think it was yesterday, he said, okay, well, we've gotten to this point, and now we can take a pause to wait, to collect more information, to see how things play out before making another decision, right? So this kind of deferral of choice, buying himself time to collect additional information, right, is very much like the logic of, it's very strategic logic of optionality there in monetary policy. Yeah.
That makes sense. And it also makes sense that in military, it would play a big role, right? I mean, for ages, probably.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
but I guess, yeah, is there something you picked up in terms of what makes a good strategic orientation, or what makes a good strategic optionality? I mean, is there something, because I know it's one of these difficult topics, they're hard to universalize, because
Exactly.
every context is different, every situation is different.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's something we're trying to explore in this terms of orientation skills, right? And so
Yeah.
it's hard to say, but yes, there anything that is that's more specific for optionality as an orientation skill?
Yeah, I mean, like you're saying, it's so specific, right? It's like a strategic response to a particular situation. But I think like some of the things that are important to deploy optionality is kind of like an orientation skill. One I would say is to have like a very active and unrestricted imagination, because
Mm,
that's the first step.
mm,
First step in weighing options or strategically orienting yourself is to have a conception or an idea of what's possible.
that's good.
Only once you have this like good idea of what's possible, can you begin to weigh those different possibilities. And I think that that's something my dissertation tries to track, is like how our imagination of future possibilities has changed over time.
Yeah, I like
And
that.
I think that it has become a little bit more skewed towards the anxious, threatening side, and maybe used to be oriented more towards the more hopeful, optimistic side. Um, so I think like that, having that kind of expansive imagination and being willing to imagine things that might seem quite far-fetched or unlikely, um, might be like really, really helpful actually in using optionality as a strategic orientation. Some other more like just general qualities of options that are desirable would be able, like, so I kind of mentioned them already, but like affordable. So like the thinking about the cost and the return and so on. Flexibility. The timing of options is really important. As I was mentioning before, like the longer an option stays in existence is really good, but also like when you choose to kind of grab it or invest in it or something. Um, and then, like I was saying, also they sometimes options have kind of like a self-fulfilling dimension to them. That kind of invoke the future that they describe at times. So, and that oftentimes has a lot to do with who is creating them or who is thinking about them, right? So large institutions like the Federal Reserve is actually a perfect example, right? When the Federal Reserve says like, we are going to raise rates next meeting, right? Bond financial markets react, and in anticipation of the Fed raising rates, they all raise their rates. And then the Fed actually doesn't have to, right? So the Fed had this option to raise rates in the future. They announced this, and just them announcing this possible option that they could do, right? The markets and the economy, right, rose and kind of made that true. So those kinds of self-fulfilling qualities of options is of course good if you have access to the kinds of powerful institutions that make that possible.
I like that. Yeah, that's really good. And I mean, it reminds me of how, I mean, all of capitalism works in the end, and all of money, right? It's an expectation for the future. And if somebody has a lot of trust, they have higher credit, and then you have more options, right? In that sense. And
Exactly.
so there's this connection of, I guess, future expectation and optionality in a way, right? And so
Absolutely, yeah.
so with your dissertation, like kind of what is your claim in terms of that historical perspective? That could be interesting. Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of the more kind of historical arc of my dissertation, um, I basically trace the kind of history of financial valuation and of ecology, or our kind of scientific understanding of the more than human world. Um, and my interest in options. Okay, so basically you could start this this question with the rise of modernity. Let's just start there. With modernity, you kind of have a disillusion or a different kind of sense of time and a different sense of the future, right? So prior to modernity, you have this notion of God's time, that the future is predetermined, everything's predetermined. Humans don't know it really just because we're so incomplete of beings, and so earthly and everything, that we couldn't possibly know God's plan. But God does have a plan, and that is already set in stone, and so your actions are not really going to affect or change the future. um, So as that began to fade, and a more kind of like secular conception of time arose, it also coincided with the rise of math, and particularly like probability theory and statistics and so on. And so basically there was an increased emphasis or higher stakes on our decisions, because we now believed that they could affect the future, that we could bring the future into being, the future that we wanted. And also this kind of growth of math and science and technology and industry, right, also gave us a strong sense of our ability to, conquer nature, and yeah, make the future what we want.
I like this very like positive enlightenment idea in a sense,
Yeah,
right? Like 18th century, like we
exactly.
use human reason, not God's reason, but human reason to, find out, to learn, and to create.
Exactly. Yeah. I sometimes think about it as a little bit of like a Promethean project, right? And you can see that very much in like the large scale infrastructure projects that I study, particularly like the state water project in California, which was the largest water infrastructure project in the world at the time that it was built. It was extremely ambitious. If you hear Pat Brown's pronouncements about it, it's very victorious sounding, right? Like he's like mastered the world, right? Like this place, like we're free from all restrictions, and we're just going to make the world exactly what we want, and nothing can hold us back, and kind of stuff, right?
What was the mission of that project? Like what did he say, to be independent of the water, or what was the idea?
Yeah, well, the context is that like everybody moved to California. They moved to Southern California, which is a complete like pretty much desert. All the rain falls in the northern part of the state, and so being able to transform this pretty barren desert landscape into a huge, booming metropolis like Los Angeles, primarily at the time, was quite a feat. And then you also have all the cultural or like associations with California, of freedom and liberty and nature and all the rest. But so yeah, so there's this kind of strong sense coming out of, to backtrack now, back again to like the modernity thing, the strong sense that we can conquer nature, and that through science, technology, labor, capital, we can very much make the world as we see fit. I think in the 70s is a kind of moment, a historical conjuncture that I look at, to think about how people began to maybe lose faith in this confidence of our ability to conquer the future and tame nature and so on. And there's like a series of overlapping crises that go on in the 70s. There's various forms of like social unrest, coming right from the 50s all the way through to the 70s. There's things like the oil shock, things like stagflation, like record high inflation and low wages, high unemployment. And in this moment, or in this period of the 70s, you go off the gold standard. You have floating exchange rates, which brings a lot of like concrete, intense new risks to financial activities. You have like the growth of the environmental movement. You have the first Earth Day, right? So as people are starting to realize the effects of industry on the environment and wanting to do something about it. There's also the publication of the Limits to Growth book, which kind of sets out really bleak prospects for future economic development based on current trajectories. And so in this moment is also the same historical moment when options theory in finance was developed, and when resilience theory in ecology was developed. It's also the same period, the same year that these three papers, that resilience kind of came into the realm of psychology as well. So there's a paper written about at-risk youth, and what ways to make them more resilient, right? So this idea of risk and resilience being kind of tied to one another, and that they really kind of, I think, exploded a little bit into the public imagination through the 70s, as things started to basically not go as planned.
so in terms of orientation, right? So the idea of orientation is that we cannot grasp it. So everyday orientation is more complex than we can ever grasp with science, with theory, and so on, right? And that's the same because the world is more complex, and we always operate in, I guess in the end, we're always operating, I mean, all the things around us, you know, the air we breathe, the floor we're on. In the end, it's the entire universe, right? And so there's something, so I wonder, so there's some, I guess, somewhat of a recognition of that aspect. So a little bit how after the Enlightenment, there was this move to romanticism, which says, well, there's always these uncertainties around us and we don't know. And it seems that in the 70s, almost paradoxically, it's theoretically grasping that which cannot be grasped in a way. I don't know. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
totally. It reminds me of affect theory, or like another name that like they put it under is like non-representational theory, which is so funny that they're trying to represent the thing in theory that you're saying cannot be represented, right? So yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's part of the thing that's so interesting and fascinating about it, and why it's such a rich field, I think, to think about, because there's probably no ultimate ground that you're ever going to get to. But
so you talk about those foresters, right? And so they first, and so you have these three stages, I remember, that you delve into. So I don't know, maybe you can explain those as
yeah,
an example.
sure. Yeah. So the first substantive chapter of my dissertation takes these foresters and tells three stories of the foresters to try to illustrate three different moments in the history of modern finance. So the first story is like the actual history, what actually happened. The second story is how the foresters would have valued this piece of land had they been doing it in the 70s after the insights of options theory. And then the third story is how they value the land today in our current conjuncture that is similar to the 70s, but kind of more supercharged and more evolved and mature and developed and stuff. So, and yeah, more with climate change is also a front and center now, where it wasn't so much in the 70s. So the first story basically looks at this theory of discounted cash flows, which I mentioned earlier. And they basically make this financial calculation or model work on the forest by putting it to work with another kind of theory of resource management, which is like maximum sustained yields. So the idea of maximum sustained yields, which is used in forestry and fishing and other types of natural resource management, is the idea that the system has a certain like upper bound limit, and if you extract beyond this limit, then it will basically collapse and it won't produce those things anymore, right? So the idea of maximum sustained yields, which was actually first proposed by Emperor Joseph II of Austria, said that we want to basically extract, or in terms of forest, like harvest as much wood as possible so that it doesn't prevent it from continuing to produce in the future, right? So by taking that kind of approach, that means that one, you're like not harvesting all of the trees at once. You're doing it intermittently throughout the years. So in terms of discounted cash flows, that brings some of the revenues closer to you in time. So they're not all 80 years out, but some of them are 10, 15, and 20, and so on. And so that increases the current net present value of the forest. But like I was saying earlier, like that model doesn't have a way, the financial model doesn't have a way of accounting for variance or volatility in the harvests. And so basically, yeah, they had to kind of like assume away all of the uncertainties and kind of pretend or imagine that the forest enterprise was going to perform just like a bond or a interest-bearing savings account, right? That was going to just have these smooth, steady returns kind of going out to perpetuity at a constant like discounting rate, compounding rate. And so there's a very like linear, smooth, unproblem, like, you know, more simple understanding of ecological change and of financial returns. So In the 70s, one of the big insights of options theory, and it even came like a little bit before options theory proper, right, was the insight about volatility, that financial returns are in fact not always linear, and in fact can be very volatile. And same thing with asset prices. And so that should be part of our valuation model. So rather than just looking at how much return it's going to bring you, the volatility of those returns and the volatility of the asset price itself is like really important, because you might have an asset that's producing high revenue or something, but if its price is very volatile and you're in a situation where you need cash, you might be forced to sell that asset when it's down, right, and lose a lot of money. So there's like the more conventional risks of like defaulting, where the person you are lending to like wouldn't pay you back, or a risk of like non-performance, where like the foresters couldn't harvest any timber. But now there's also the risk of volatility, that the prices of the assets will be like much lower when you need to sell them, and therefore you're taking these permanent losses that you can't really get back.
That's kind of what happened with the Silicon Valley Bank, right?
Yes, that's kind of what happened with Silicon Valley
We
Bank.
we don't have to go there now. You can.
Yeah.
You can,
But yeah, that's right. They had long duration assets that had like went down in value a lot because interest rates went up, and they had basically big losses on their books. So if you let those bonds mature, they would have matured at their full face value. But if Silicon Valley Bank had to sell them today, right, because interest rates had gone up, they would be taking a serious loss. And so the Fed created a window where all the banks can trade them at par. So none of the banks have to take the losses. So once volatility kind of gets brought into the analysis, you're going to want to kind of create optionality, which discounted cash flows doesn't have any. And so rather than investing in the forestry enterprise and just putting all of your money there and waiting for those steady returns, there are different ways that an options analysis would try to value the forest. So one way to do it in a more like kind of materialist way, right, would be a more diversified form of agriculture, right? So if you think about planting cover crops, or having a agro forestry, or forest, I think it's called agroforestry, right, which is when you have both forestry and agriculture kind of overlapping on the same plot of land, right? So that if there was in fact some kind of timber epidemic, or like a spike in wheat prices, right, you would be able to adapt to each of those situations, because you now have a more diversified portfolio of options, as opposed to having all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. Another more kind of less materialist, more financial way that they might have valued the forest is to write call options on the timber, the uncut timber. So rather than timber just being a source of future income, the timber in that form serves as a mechanism to like store and accumulate value. So by not cutting the timber and by selling options on future timber, you are basically creating new assets, derivatives, based on the other asset, which is the timber, without turning the timber into like a raw material input yet.
A call option is that you set the value at a certain price in the future.
Yeah, call option basically gives the owner the right, but not the obligation, to buy a certain thing at up to some point in the future at a predetermined price. So if, for example, a furniture company, right, needs to buy a lot of wood, and maybe the price of wood is volatile, they might buy a call option on wood in the case that they want to, perhaps they think that we might expand production later in the year, but we don't want to get stuck with a really high wood price, but we also don't want to be stuck holding all this wood if we don't expand production. So we'll buy a call option on the timber that gives us the right to buy this wood at this preset price that we've already budgeted for, and it gives us the option, but we don't have to tie up all the capital. And so one of the interesting things about options is that their value is derived largely from the volatility of the underlying index or asset or commodity or whatever it is that's being written on. So the more volatile timber prices become, the more valuable the options are. And so this, for example, has been in like finance and economics textbooks since like the 70s in the case of oil. So countries like Saudi Arabia, often they're sitting on large oil reserves, and they will oftentimes sell options on the reserves, right? So they're basically exercising their option not to drill. And with a situation like with OPEC or something, because they control such a large portion of the supply, right? Like their decisions can directly affect the price of oil. And so if you have both the ability to affect the price of oil, for example, make it more or less volatile, and you have large oil reserves that you're sitting on that you can sell options on, you can make a lot of income and revenue without actually extracting or producing any oil. And so the same model could have been, the foresters could have applied the same model to their forest in the sense of exercising their option not to fell the forest and instead sell options on the forest timber. And they might even have some impacts on the price of timber in the process, which might make those options even more valuable. So
Interesting.
that's, yeah, that's what kind of the story of the 70s. And then the third story kind of turns to a different field. And so I talk about buzz hauling too in that second story, right? They had to have recognized that ecosystems were complex and non-equilibrium and so on to pursue these kind of more diversified strategies. And then the third story, I talk about the rise of ecosystem services as a framework for valuing nature or thinking about nature as an asset. And in this story, foresters might be inclined to sell carbon credits based on the forest. So they might work with like a nonprofit organization like the Nature Conservancy to certify that their forest is in fact being left as a forest and it is in fact absorbing this much CO2 from the atmosphere, for example. And then the Nature Conservancy and that would help them sell carbon credits on international carbon markets to, you know, people who need them, whether that be oil companies who are emitting a lot of fossil fuels, or car companies, or even to like airlines. And the airlines will then embed those carbon credits like into your ticket. So we talked about one of the upgrade options that you get on tickets now, right? You can buy it, you could pay a little bit more for that ticket that uses a little less emissions. That's because like that airline bought some carbon offset credits from some foresters somewhere, likely in the global south. And they bought it on the market, right? So that's kind of like that. The crux of that story is about making options or assets liquid, right? So the first story is about assetization, the process of making something an asset, the forest, which previously wasn't. The second story is about like the value of optionality, recognizing the difference between the option and the choice, and there's value in having time and the right to choose. And then the third story is really about making assets liquid, and even like what we might call like resilient liquidity, in the sense that even in moments of heightened uncertainty or crisis, the asset maintains its value and a demand for the asset. So government treasuries, like US treasuries, are the most liquid assets. Oftentimes, if there's a sense of uncertainty or a sense of like dooming crisis or something, right, there's what they call in finance like a fleet to safety, where everyone like just runs for the most secure risk-free assets, which are US government bonds and cash. And so, but interestingly, what options have done is you can have a government bond which pays you a certain interest rate of kind of a lower interest rate, but is very, very low risk. And you can take a private debt, it would be a corporate bond or a mortgage or asset-backed security, and write a put option on it or you could also think about it as a credit default swap. It's another popular instrument used to do this, that basically end up making the private debt and option portfolio mimic a government treasury, right? So you have basically, they've made synthetic public debt out of private debt plus options. And so this like adds to, like the resilience of financial markets and, those who trade in them and who own all that capital, right? Because you can create like a very secure, safe place to store your capital. And so just to bring it back to the carbon credits, increasingly they want to create assets that maintain their liquidity in moments of crisis so that you don't have to sell them into a falling market and so on. And carbon credits are increasingly serving this fund.
Yeah.
So ecosystem services, right, it's kind of like a new way of understanding nature that doesn't see it as raw material input into commodity production, but rather sees it as the grounds upon which financial assets can be produced. So whether that be carbon credits from a forest sequestering carbon, or a coral reefs or a wetlands capacity to absorb storm surge and therefore protect coastal real estate, right? We've find ecosystem services as a framework to try to understand the services that nature provides us as having a financial value that we can calculate and monetize. And so in this way, you don't have to extract nature to make a profit off of it. And so the liquidity thing was interesting, just in pointing out that these assets that for a while have been not seen as particularly safe, and have been oftentimes have been found out to be quite dubious or not quite what they said they were. For example, forest offset credits. So there have been many cases where ecosystem service schemes get set up in a developing country, and they are supposed to be sequestering X amount of carbon from the atmosphere. Those credits are sold somewhere else, and then people go back and it turns out that the forest enterprise didn't absorb that much carbon or something like this, right? There's also many other problems with them in terms of the way that they can displace local residents, not return a lot of the funds, the resources from the sale of the credits back to the communities that were either displaced or that harvested the forest or worked the land in the first place. But effectively, it's interesting that carbon credits are now seen as being safe enough and legitimate enough to be used in repo contracts. So they're seen to be not as volatile and maintain their liquidity and their value even in moments of uncertainty. Otherwise, they wouldn't be used in those kinds of contracts. So that's what the third story about is making assets on nature liquid.
In terms of everyday life, right? So that is something I know that you also kind of have done some work on in terms of how we experience that shift, right? For perhaps young people, for in our, I don't know, working people in our working life, and in how we invest in when we grow up and so on. So is there, how does that logic of optionality, how has that impacted us in the last decades, maybe, or differently, right? Like in the 70s or 50s, 70s, today?
Yeah. Well, I think optionality, like resilience, I think becomes more valuable or more desirable the more uncertain and at risk one feels. And so I think since the 70s, you've seen a lot of just processes that have caused people to be more at risk and to feel more precarious, whether it be the kind of change in the labor market from more steady long-term jobs to kind of gig work and a lot of like low-paid service industry jobs that don't necessarily provide you with any kind of job security or like long-term benefits, whether they be healthcare or retirements or things like that, right? So we have a big shift in the labor market towards more precarious forms of work. And then, going on at the same time, you have the rolling back of a lot of government programs that were in place to support people in need. So as the labor market has become more precarious, we've also lost some of the protections for people in precarious labor positions. You also have things like the rise of like global financialization, which has brought like more economic instability, I think, and volatility in terms of economics, speeding up the business cycle and so on. So you have more intense and more frequent booms and busts, perhaps. Then you also, maybe to get out of the economic sphere, right, we have increasing volatility in our environment, right? We have climate change causing more intense and more frequent unexpected storms. You also have like a real kind of profusion of complexity within the social world, right? Like Nicholas Luhmann has written a lot about this in terms of the complex differentiation of our society. So there's also a lot more options. So beyond the profusion of economic threats that might be lurking out there for you, and the environmental uncertainties and volatilities that might be coming your way, you also just have like a far more complex and differentiated social world to navigate, right? So whether it be in terms of one's like gender or sexual identity and orientation, where one wants to live, traveling is easier, remote like work is more flexible. So there's like that issue as well. And then you add things on top of that, like the kind of what I would consider a lot of people here in California call like the housing crisis, the intense like insecurity around housing. And so I don't know, I guess I just listed a bunch of things that kind of would make one desire resilient optionality, right? If you had a really stable, easily predictable, steady life with a really secure job and your retirement was all taken care of and you owned your home and like so on and so forth, then like you maybe not be so interested in optionality. Like you have the thing that you want, that you need, and there's not much. But if you are feeling at risk, if you're feeling precarious, if you're feeling like you could never get caught up, or then you might be a little bit more interested in trying to think about how can I make myself resilient? What kind of options can I secure for myself so that when these uncertainties arise, I can navigate them. A common example that I oftentimes talk about is, and I have talked about this, one of my advisors, Robert Meister, talks about this a lot too, is the educational world. So in addition to those other things that I was talking about with like stagnant wages and increased flexibility and precarity of work and loss of a lot of government programs and stuff, you also have like the rise of debt, right? So people are also far more indebted today for things like housing or education or healthcare than they have in the past. And so if you're going to make this big investment in your education, and you know that the job market is changing quite rapidly, then you might want to, for example, double major. You might want to hedge your desire to be an artist or a writer with a business major too, in case that art thing doesn't work out for you, and so I think there's a lot of ways, or even like I've written about more mundane examples where you arrive at college and you're walking around the job fair or the community or the clubs and all that stuff, right? And you're trying to think, okay, there are so many options here, like how do I pick which ones I want to go to? Sometimes students will like go to like the first class of a seminar to kind of like feel it out, right, before they've actually signed up for the class. And this is kind of a way of like deferring that choice collecting a little bit more information and deciding after you have that information, what your schedule is going to be. Or you might go to the first meeting of the hacky sack club or whatever, just try to feel it out and get a sense before you make any strong commitments as to like what club you really want to join and stuff like that. There's like another example I've written about in the past has to do with like Hurricane Sandy in New York City. There's a good book by sociologist Rebecca Elliott called Underwater. And in it, she talks about this woman, Grace, who raised her house in response to basically flood insurance premiums going up. But then Hurricane Sandy happened and they kind of switched the maps. The maps used to be, this is another big part of my research, the maps used to be historical looking, right? So they would just take this historical data and project that historical data into the future. And part of this big shift in the 70s in terms of the epistemology and ontology, right, really kind of really undermined that way of thinking, that we can just project our historical data into the future and that's what's going to happen. No, the future is actually unpredictable. And so once they changed the flood maps with this insight in mind, being oriented more towards future possible climate scenarios, right? That changed the flood maps again, and she was forced to basically forced to either raise her home again a second time or move away because she couldn't afford to stay there, right? And so there's this like quote in there where she says, I did my due diligence, I spent $100 grand, I raised the house, and now they want me to do it again. And I mean, where am I going to come up with $100 grand? I could raise the house, but then I won't be sending my kids to college, right? So here are like a set of options, right? I could raise my house, take out $100,000 loan, but there's a trade-off there, right? So that's a bad option. Or I could send my kids to college, but I can't have both,
Mm-hmm.
And so these are some of the so yeah, that's a bad option of everyday life in terms of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just stop
Yeah.
there.
So one part it seems is that there is greater anxieties. Is that what you're saying also today? Kind of the anxiety of being left behind is stronger. There's so many options, and so we feel the pressure of keeping options open in order to not be left behind. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting, kind of, if you think about in terms of because in terms of wealth, right? I mean, it's just been going up in, let's say, the last hundreds of years, right? We have never been richer overall, right? I mean, or we have never been like healthier, or if you, I mean, like how many people died, mortality rates, and people who are right, and so overall we should be in a better spot, right? I mean,
Well,
but it's kind of it, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So I wonder if that is something. I mean, first the question is that true, right? And so kind of if are the like an absolute term, not in relativistic terms, right? In relative terms, then the gap is raising, but the poor are probably better off today than 50 years ago or 100 years ago, right? But but the question would be then, if that's true, is it because there are so many options that we have that anxiety of being left behind? So is it a mental aspect alone, right? Or is there a materialistic aspect to it?
I definitely think there's a materialist aspect to it. Like I think the idea that we're richer than we've ever been is like a little bit too much of an aggregate statement for my comfort level. So yes, the total amount of wealth, like for example in the United States, is higher than it's ever been. But the level of inequality is actually also as high as it's ever been. So most people don't have access to most of that wealth. And so if you come to California, you'll see this really stark dramatic thing where you have these whole neighborhoods filled with millions and millions of dollars houses, most of them which are empty. And right around the corner, there's all these homeless encampments. So I think that, and then with things like climate change, that's very material. So I think there is a material element to it for sure. there's an interesting piece just on the wealth thing real quick, like an interesting piece in the New York Times published recently. And it was interesting because it talked about how millennial generation for a long time has been like, there's a big narrative out there about how the millennials got kind of screwed over. And we're never going to be able to buy a house and all this stuff. And this new piece in the New York Times was interesting because it talks about like the largest generational wealth transfer in history. And it's going to be from the boomers to the millennials, right? So it's kind of skipping Gen X, right? So the millennials are going to be wealthier than Gen X and wealthier than Gen Y. But one of the things that's interesting, if just based on the nature of how capital accumulates, right? This idea of compound interest means that whatever wealth existed in the boomers has grown for however long it's grown. But it's grown, of course, at a very unequal rate. So the people at the top end of the boomers have grown exponentially more than the people at the lower end. And so when that transfer happens to the millennials, that inequality is going to intensify, right? So the millennial generation will be richer and more unequal than the boomer generation. And so while I don't deny that there are certainly psychological aspects to the anxiety, and I think a lot of those are like, compellingly tied to various forms of technology, but also like social arrangements, things like this, just like more kind of isolated, individualistic society and culture more generally. So I definitely think psychology is part of it, but I also think that there's just a tremendous, and for example, even like poor white rural Americans are dying, actually, like their life expectancy has decreased like over the past 10 years. So I wouldn't necessarily say that like things are just a rising tide raises all boats, or that it's gotten better for everybody. I personally don't think it has. But I think that resilient optionality is something that people desire because they feel at risk and they feel precarious. And one of the things that I'm interested in is how can we pursue that resilient optionality through a more collective lens that recognizes that we are kind of all in this together. And in that way, we can like have each other's back and not leave each other behind, right? And it's, actually, I just want to say one last thing. The optionality and resilience, I think, has always been vested in communities, in sociality, right? So if you think about anthropologists like Marcel Mauss or David Graeber, right, they talk about these gift economies, right, where there was basically a kind of reciprocal exchange of things people needed, right? One way to understand those is like options. They're contingent claims, right? So if I live near the river and my hut floods, I go and I stay with you, and you're near the forest and there's a forest fire and your hut burns down, right? Then like you can come stay with me, right? So I think that what makes people resilient and what options are social. Fundamentally, there are social lives, or social networks and social communities. But I feel like over time, those options have been kind of alienated from the communities, right? First, kind of in the form of the state, right? If you think about the welfare state or the Soviet state, right? Like the collectivity was vested there. And so you turn to the state for your resiliency and your options and so on. And I think since the 70s with you have seen the kind of further privatization where those options and that resilience now is taken out of the state and placed more within financial institutions. And those financial institutions can sell you forms of resiliency. So they can give you a loan so you can go to school so you can be more resilient on the job market. Or they can sell you an insurance contract so you can be more resilient and have that option like when the fire comes. And so I think remembering that kind of that optionality and that resilience is a product of sociality is really important to the way we can kind of like reconceptualize what's going on in finance and what finance does, and maybe try to think about a more collective liberatory form of finance.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that because when I think about again East Germany, so paradoxically, it created that sense of community very strongly, right? Although the state kind of owned everything, but there was this sense of, okay, we're all in this together anyways, and we all make the same money, and we have to help each other out. And so that's what happened. Interesting, right? Right. And so, and whereas with capitalism, it's that idea, okay, like it's that freedom, but it's also your responsibility, right? You're your own, you have to create your own future. It's your responsibility. And the world, I mean, just has grown so much more complex, right? And because maybe one thing to push back a little bit is that idea of when you think about like in human history, the last hundreds of years, at least, I mean, especially in Europe, just the last 100 years, war was always an option, right? Having been drafted to war was always an option. War coming to you was an option, right? And so that is something that we haven't had, right? And so we have had the most peaceful time ever in Europe for sure, right? And in the US for so much longer. And but somehow we don't, that is not that's what I mean, right? That is that option of having to die because of war. We don't really consider this anymore, and we're not afraid of it, right? And like somehow we are more afraid because we have to create our own future than if it's more or less destiny which takes care of us, right?
Yeah, I think so. There's, I think, a big truth in that. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure in making the world what you want it to be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right. So I wonder if that is maybe also, I mean, yeah, what we kind of talked about, right? The increase of options, that alone, and like every decision today, make use of your time, right?
yeah,
This financialization of every day of our life is
yeah,
kind of what creates that pressure. And then, and if you have the money of all the options, then you're fine. If you don't, then you're more left behind, right?
yeah. It's, I mean, it's like a logic of just to go back to the bigger modernity thing, right? It's like a logic of optimization, right? And
Yeah.
when it's placed in this kind of financial infrastructure, it can be very uh, suffocating almost sometimes, right? Like having to check all the credit scores and credit cards and bank accounts and loans and
Yeah.
yeah, all the rest of it.
Yeah.